At 9:47 p.m. on a fictional October night in Los Angeles, Bruno Mars was standing beneath a wall of golden stage lights, 30,000 people singing along with him, when he suddenly stopped in the middle of a song. The band continued for 2 seconds before Bruno raised one hand. The music died instantly. 30,000 voices disappeared with it. Bruno lowered his microphone and stared toward the far left section of the stadium. Nobody knew what he had seen. His drummer leaned forward. The guitarist looked toward security. Even the giant screens above the stage went still. Bruno didn't move. He simply stared. Then he pointed toward a man standing behind the security barrier. "You," Bruno said. The man looked behind himself, confused. Bruno pointed again. "Yeah, you with the guitar." The stranger slowly lifted his head. He was wearing an old gray jacket, worn jeans, and a black baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. An acoustic guitar hung from his shoulder. He looked like someone who had accidentally wandered into a world where he didn't belong. Bruno smiled gently. "What's your name?" The man didn't answer. Bruno waited. The stranger's mouth opened, but nothing came out. A security guard leaned toward him. The man whispered something into the guard's ear. The guard looked toward the stage. "Daniel," he said. Bruno's expression changed. "Daniel." The stranger nodded. For some reason, that single name seemed to hit Bruno harder than anyone expected. He lowered his microphone completely. "Can you come up here?" Daniel immediately shook his head. The crowd began cheering, but Bruno raised his hand. "It's okay. You don't have to." Daniel looked down at his guitar. "I can't," he whispered. Bruno heard him through the nearby monitor and smiled. "Can't or won't?" Daniel looked up. Bruno waited. Daniel's eyes were already wet. "Both." A nervous laugh moved through the audience, but Bruno didn't laugh. He stepped toward the edge of the stage. "Okay," he said softly. "Then we won't make you." He paused. "But can I ask you one question?" Daniel nodded. Bruno pointed at the guitar. "Why are you holding that like it's the most important thing you own?" Daniel looked down at it. His fingers tightened around the neck. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "Because it belonged to my brother." Bruno's smile disappeared. "What's your brother's name?" Daniel looked directly at him. "Michael." Bruno took a slow breath. "Where is he?" Daniel's eyes dropped. "He's been gone for 21 years. The stadium became so quiet that Daniel's next words seemed to travel through the entire building. "And I haven't played this guitar since the night he died." Bruno stood motionless. Somewhere behind him, the keyboard player slowly lowered his hands from the keys. The audience no longer felt like an audience. They were witnesses to something none of them understood. Bruno looked at Daniel again. "Why bring it here tonight?" Daniel's answer came after a long pause. "Because somebody told me I had to." Bruno frowned. "Who?" Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph. He looked at it but didn't hand it over. "I don't know." Bruno's eyes narrowed. "You don't know?" Daniel shook his head. "It showed up in my mailbox this morning." Bruno looked toward security. "And you brought it to the concert?" "Yes." "Why?" Daniel swallowed. "Because there was something written on the back." Bruno waited. Daniel turned the photograph around. Even from the stage, Bruno could see black handwriting across the faded paper. "What does it say?" Bruno asked. Daniel looked at the words. "Don't let him give up." Bruno stared at him. "Who wrote that?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know." The audience erupted into whispers. Bruno stepped away from the microphone and spoke quietly to one of his crew members. The crew member hurried toward him. Bruno said something too quiet for the audience to hear, then turned back to Daniel. "Listen," he said. "You don't have to come up here. But if you want to tell me what happened, I'll listen." Daniel looked around the stadium. 30,000 strangers were watching him. He looked terrified. "I don't know how to tell it." Bruno nodded. "Start anywhere." Daniel looked at the guitar. "Okay." He took a breath. "My brother gave me this when I was 21. Bruno nodded. "He was older?" 3 years. Daniel smiled faintly. "He thought he was smarter than me." Bruno laughed softly. "Older brothers usually do." Daniel almost smiled. Then his face changed again. "Michael was the reason I played." He ran his thumb along a deep scratch in the guitar. I used to play on sidewalks, restaurants, little bars, anywhere somebody would let me set up. Were you good? Bruno asked. Daniel hesitated. He thought I was. That's what matters. Daniel looked at him. You would have liked him. Bruno smiled. Sounds like I missed out. Daniel nodded. Yeah, you did. A few people in the crowd laughed gently, but Daniel's eyes remained sad. Michael was the one who pushed me. He'd say, "You're always waiting until you're ready. You're never going to be ready." Bruno nodded slowly. Sounds familiar. Daniel looked at him. You ever feel that way? Bruno smiled. Every day. Daniel looked surprised. Really? Sure. Anybody who says they're never afraid is probably lying. That answer seemed to relax Daniel slightly. He looked down at the guitar. Michael wanted me to play professionally. And you? I wanted to be good enough first. Bruno nodded. That's the trap. Daniel smiled sadly. Exactly. He paused. We had a little show planned 21 years ago. Tiny place downtown. Maybe 40 people. Bruno listened. Michael was going to come. He promised. Daniel's voice became quieter. He never made it. Bruno's eyes softened. The accident? Daniel nodded. Someone ran a red light. He looked toward the audience. I got the call 20 minutes before the show. Bruno didn't interrupt. I remember standing outside that little bar with this guitar in my hands. People were walking past me. Music was coming from inside. And I couldn't move. Daniel swallowed hard. I thought if I went inside, it meant the world was continuing without him. Bruno lowered his head. So I put the guitar away. For 21 years? Daniel nodded. I played a little here and there, quietly, but never on a stage. Bruno looked at the guitar again. Until tonight. Until tonight. Bruno thought for a moment. What changed? Daniel looked toward the photograph. This. He lifted it. This arrived this morning. Bruno stared at the picture. It showed two young men sitting outside a music store. One was Daniel. The other was Michael. Between them was the same guitar. On the back, beneath the words, "Don't let him give up," was a date. Bruno squinted. That's 21 years ago. Daniel nodded. The day before he died. Bruno's face tightened. You're saying someone wrote that 21 years ago? I think so. But you don't know who? No. Bruno looked toward the crowd. And you came here because... Daniel interrupted. Because Michael loved you. Bruno blinked. Me? Daniel nodded. He used to listen to your music. Bruno smiled faintly. Before I was famous? Before you were famous. Daniel looked at the photograph. He said you understood people who were scared to be heard. Bruno looked down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he walked toward Daniel. Can I see the picture? Daniel hesitated before handing it to him. Bruno held it carefully. The image was old and faded, but the two brothers were clearly happy. Michael had one arm around Daniel. Both were smiling. Bruno turned it over. He read the handwriting again. Then he noticed something beneath it. A second line had been scratched out. What's under here? He asked. Daniel looked confused. What? Bruno tilted the photograph toward the stage light. There's something underneath. Daniel stepped closer. Bruno angled it under the light. Faint letters appeared beneath the black ink. Daniel's face changed. I never saw that. Bruno looked carefully. The hidden words were barely visible. They appeared to say, he doesn't know yet. Daniel stared. What does that mean? Bruno shook his head. I don't know. Daniel's breathing became faster. Who doesn't know what? Bruno looked at him. That's the question. Suddenly, one of the stage technicians approached Bruno and whispered something into his ear. Bruno's expression changed. You're sure? The technician nodded. Bruno looked at Daniel. Where did you say you found the photograph? My mailbox. Anyone else have access to your mailbox? Daniel shook his head. No. And nobody contacted you? No. Bruno looked toward the technician again. Then how did they know you were coming here tonight? Daniel's face went pale. I didn't tell anyone. Bruno stepped closer. Did you buy the ticket yourself? Yes. When? Daniel hesitated. 3 weeks ago. Bruno frowned. The stadium lights dimmed until only a narrow circle of light remained around Bruno, Daniel, and Eleanor, while 30,000 people stared at the photograph in Daniel's trembling hands. The music had stopped completely, but nobody seemed ready to leave. Somewhere in the upper sections, a child whispered to her mother, asking what was happening. Down near the stage, security guards stood frozen, unsure whether this was still a concert or something much more personal. Bruno looked at the photograph again. The young man standing beside Michael was unmistakable. His face was younger, his hair longer, and his expression far less recognizable than it would have been years later, but Bruno knew him. He had seen him before. The question was where. Daniel noticed the hesitation in Bruno's face. "You know him," he said. Bruno slowly nodded. "I think I do." "Who is he?" Bruno turned the photograph toward him. "His name is Marcus Reed." Daniel frowned. "Who?" "A musician." Eleanor stepped closer. "Not just a musician." Bruno looked at her. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a breath. "Michael worked with him." Daniel stared at the photograph. "My brother never told me." "That was the point," Eleanor said. Daniel looked confused. "What point?" Eleanor glanced toward the audience, then back at him. "Michael was trying to protect you." Daniel shook his head. "Protect me from what?" Nobody answered immediately. Bruno finally spoke. "Maybe we should get somewhere quieter." Daniel looked around at the stadium. "You mean backstage?" Bruno nodded. "Yeah." Daniel looked frightened again. "I don't think I can." Bruno smiled gently. "You've already done the hardest part." Daniel looked at the guitar. "Have I?" "You walked onto a stage after 21 years. Bruno paused. "Whatever comes next, you don't have to face it alone." Daniel looked at Eleanor, then at the photograph. Finally, he nodded. The audience began applauding softly as Bruno helped him stand. But before they could leave, Daniel suddenly stopped. "Wait." Bruno turned. Daniel pointed toward the giant screen. The photograph was still displayed above them. "There's something behind him." Bruno looked up. The image operator zoomed in. Behind Michael and Marcus was the entrance to a small recording studio. Above the door was a faded sign. "Harbor Sound." Daniel stared. "That's where Michael used to go." Bruno looked at him. "You know the place?" "Yeah, but it closed years ago." Eleanor shook her head. "Not exactly." Daniel turned. "What do you mean?" She looked toward Bruno. "The building closed. The studio didn't." Daniel's eyes widened. "What?" Eleanor lowered her voice. "There are still people who use the old rooms." Daniel looked at Bruno. "Who?" Eleanor hesitated. "Marcus." The name seemed to hang in the air. Bruno looked toward the backstage entrance. "Then maybe that's where the key goes." Daniel looked down at the brass key in his palm. "You think this opens something at Harbor Sound?" Eleanor nodded. "Michael told me it did." Daniel stared at her. "You knew this all along?" "I knew the key existed. I didn't know where you were." "And you never told me?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I promised Michael." Daniel's voice became sharper. "You promised him what?" Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. "That I would wait until you were ready." Daniel shook his head. "I wasn't ready tonight." Eleanor smiled sadly. "You came anyway." Bruno stepped between them gently. "Let's take this one step at a time." Daniel looked at him. "Why do you care?" Bruno seemed surprised by the question. "Because you're standing here." Daniel waited. Bruno continued. "And because I know what it feels like when music becomes more than music." Daniel looked at him. "What does it become?" Bruno thought for a moment. "A place where people keep the parts of themselves they don't know how to say out loud." Daniel stared at him. Michael would have liked that answer. Bruno smiled. "I would have liked him." They walked backstage together. The roar of the audience faded behind them. Technicians moved quietly through the corridors, giving them space. Daniel held the guitar case tightly. Eleanor followed. Bruno walked beside Daniel. As they reached a quiet room, Daniel stopped. "I need to ask you something." Bruno turned. "Sure." "Why did you recognize my brother's name?" Bruno looked confused. "I didn't." Daniel frowned. "You reacted when I said Michael." Bruno leaned against the wall. Because I thought I remembered the name. From where? Bruno closed his eyes briefly. A very long time ago, before I was who I am now. Daniel watched him. Did you know him? No, not personally. Then what do you remember? Bruno took a breath. I remember hearing a story about a young musician who helped another musician when nobody else would. Daniel stared. Who told you? Bruno hesitated. My old mentor. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Marcus. Bruno nodded. Marcus knew Michael. Daniel looked at the photograph. So this is connected to you. Bruno didn't deny it. Maybe. Eleanor placed the letter on the table. There's something you both need to understand. She opened an old folder she had been carrying. Inside were several photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Daniel stared at the first photograph. It showed Michael standing beside Marcus outside Harbor Sound. Another showed Michael sitting behind a mixing desk. Another showed a group of young musicians. Daniel picked up one photograph. I've never seen these. Eleanor nodded. Michael kept them hidden. Why? Because he didn't want your father to know. Daniel looked confused. My father. Eleanor nodded. Your father believed music was a waste of time. Daniel's face tightened. I know. He wanted Michael to become an engineer. Daniel laughed bitterly. He wanted both of us to become engineers. Eleanor smiled sadly. Michael rebelled. Daniel looked through the photographs. And I thought I was the rebellious one. You were, Eleanor said. Michael just hid it better. Daniel laughed softly for the first time that night. Bruno watched him. Tell me about your brother. Daniel looked at the photograph. He was fearless. He paused. At least that's what I thought. Eleanor shook her head. He was afraid of plenty. Daniel looked up. Of what? Eleanor answered. Of losing you. Daniel's smile disappeared. Why? Eleanor looked at the letter. Because Michael knew you were talented. But he also knew you were more afraid of disappointing people than you were afraid of failing. Daniel looked down. That's true. He believed that fear would eventually make you disappear. Daniel's eyes became wet. It did. Bruno sat across from him. Not completely. Daniel looked at him. What do you mean? You're here. Daniel smiled sadly. Barely. Bruno shook his head. Barely is still here. Daniel looked away. Then Eleanor opened another envelope. There's one more thing. Daniel groaned softly. How many secrets did my brother have? Eleanor smiled. More than you knew. She handed him a folded newspaper clipping. Daniel unfolded it. The headline read, Young musician refuses major record deal. Daniel stared. That's Michael. Bruno leaned over. He turned down a record contract? Eleanor nodded. A very good one. Daniel looked shocked. Why? Eleanor said. Because the contract required him to leave Marcus behind. Daniel stared at the article. He wouldn't do that. No. Eleanor looked at Bruno. He said he wouldn't build a career by abandoning the person who helped him find his voice. Bruno was silent. Daniel whispered. He never told me. He didn't want you to feel guilty. Daniel looked at her. Guilty for what? Eleanor hesitated. For being the reason he stayed. Daniel froze. What? Eleanor slowly explained that Michael had once planned to leave Los Angeles with Marcus to pursue music. But Daniel had been struggling at home, and Michael stayed because he didn't want to leave his younger brother alone. Daniel shook his head. That's not fair. It wasn't about fairness, Eleanor said. It was love. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. I never asked him to stay. I know. Then why does it feel like I did? Bruno quietly answered. Because grief always tries to turn love into blame. Daniel looked at him. Bruno continued. Sometimes we blame ourselves because it feels easier than accepting we had no control. Daniel stared out at the empty corridor. You talk like you've thought about this. Bruno smiled faintly. Everybody loses people. The details are different. The feeling isn't. Daniel nodded. For several seconds, there was only the hum of the building. Then the door opened. One of Bruno's crew members entered. Bruno, there's someone asking for you. Bruno looked up. Who? The crew member hesitated. He says his name is Marcus Reed. Daniel turned around so quickly that the chair behind him moved. Eleanor closed her eyes. The streets of Los Angeles were almost empty as Bruno's car turned away from the bright downtown avenues and into an older industrial district where the buildings seemed forgotten by time. Daniel sat in the back seat with Michael's guitar resting across his knees, his thumbs slowly moving over the worn wood, as if he were trying to feel a memory buried beneath the scratches. In the front passenger seat, Marcus stared through the windshield without saying a word. Eleanor sat beside Daniel, holding the old photograph. Bruno drove quietly. Nobody had played music in the car. Nobody had asked a question for several minutes. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "How far?" Marcus looked ahead. 10 minutes. Daniel nodded. "I've been here before." Marcus glanced back. "You have." "Once. When I was 19. Daniel frowned. "Michael wouldn't let me inside." Marcus smiled faintly. "He was trying to protect you. Everyone keeps saying that." Daniel looked frustrated. "What was he protecting me from?" Marcus didn't answer. Bruno glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Maybe you'll find out tonight." The old Harbor Sound building appeared at the end of a narrow street. Most of its windows were dark. The sign above the entrance had lost several letters, leaving only Harbor SOU_. A chain hung loosely across the main door. Bruno parked nearby. They stepped out. The air smelled like rain, metal, and old concrete. Daniel looked up at the building. "It hasn't changed." Marcus shook his head. "It changed. You just remember it differently." Daniel gave him a confused look. Marcus walked toward a side entrance. He pulled a small key from his pocket. "This still works?" Daniel asked. "Some things don't know when to die." The door opened with a long metallic groan. Inside, the hallway was dark. Marcus switched on a flashlight. Dust floated through the beam. Daniel followed closely, carrying the guitar. Bruno walked behind him. Eleanor closed the door. The building seemed to breathe around them. Every footstep echoed. They passed old posters, broken equipment, and faded photographs of musicians who had once dreamed of becoming famous. Daniel stopped in front of one photograph. He recognized Michael immediately. He was standing on a small stage, laughing with a microphone in his hand. Daniel touched the glass. "I never saw this." Marcus looked at him. "He didn't want you to." "Why?" "Because you would have asked questions." Daniel turned. "I should have asked." Marcus sighed. "We all should have." They continued down the corridor until Marcus stopped at a door marked B17. Daniel looked at the brass key. His hand tightened. "This is it." Marcus nodded. "Michael called it the room nobody used." Daniel stared at the lock. "Why?" "Because it was his." Daniel inserted the key. Turned with surprising ease. The door opened. The room was small. Dust covered almost everything. A broken piano sat against one wall. Old microphones hung from hooks. A wooden desk stood near the window. But the most striking thing was the wall. It was covered with handwritten notes, photographs, song lyrics, ticket stubs, and dozens of small pieces of paper. Daniel stepped inside. He recognized his brother's handwriting immediately. "Oh my God!" Bruno looked around. "He left all this?" Marcus nodded. Daniel moved toward the wall. There were notes from years ago. "Danny played this today. Danny finally finished the bridge. Danny says he's quitting. Danny says he's not good enough. Danny doesn't believe me." Daniel touched one note. His eyes filled with tears. "He wrote everything down." Marcus said. "He was afraid he'd forget." Daniel laughed softly. "He never forgot anything." He looked at another note. "He remembered things I don't." Eleanor stepped closer. "That's why this room matters." Daniel turned. "Why?" She pointed toward the desk. "Because Michael wasn't only writing about you." Daniel looked at the desk. A small recorder sat beside a stack of notebooks. Bruno walked over and picked up one of them. The cover read, "Tomorrow." Daniel froze. "That's the song." Marcus nodded. "Yes." Daniel reached for it. His hands shook as he opened the first page. The lyrics were handwritten. Some lines were crossed out. Others had been rewritten. At the bottom of the page was a note. "For Danny, when he's ready." Daniel whispered. "He wrote this for me." Bruno nodded. "Looks like it." Daniel turned the page. Another note appeared. If I leave before he understands, tell him the song was never about losing someone. It was about finding your way back. Daniel closed the notebook. He knew. Marcus asked. Knew what? That I'd blame myself. Eleanor shook her head. He knew you would try. Daniel sat on the floor. I spent 21 years thinking he died because I wasn't there. Marcus looked down. That's not what happened. Daniel looked up sharply. You know that. Marcus nodded. I was the last person to see him alive. The room became silent. Daniel stood. What? Marcus swallowed. I saw Michael the night before the accident. You never told me. I couldn't. Why? Marcus looked toward the wall. Because he asked me not to. Daniel stepped closer. What did he say? Marcus took a breath. He told me he had made a decision. Daniel waited. He was going to stop chasing a record deal. Daniel frowned. Why? Because he wanted to help you. Daniel shook his head. No. You just said he didn't sacrifice his life for me. Marcus nodded. He didn't. But he made a choice. What choice? Marcus looked directly at Daniel. He decided to build a small recording studio here. He wanted to teach young musicians. He wanted to help people who couldn't afford lessons. Daniel stared at the room. This place. Marcus nodded. This room was supposed to become the heart of it. Daniel looked around. But he never did. No. Daniel whispered. Because he died. Marcus nodded. And after he died, I couldn't bring myself to finish it. Daniel walked toward the broken piano. Why? Marcus answered. Because every time I entered this room, I heard him. Bruno stepped closer. So why keep it locked? Marcus looked at him. Because sometimes people mistake preserving a memory for honoring it. Bruno nodded. And sometimes you have to let the room become useful again. Marcus looked at him. That's what Michael would have said. Daniel opened another notebook. Inside were names. Dozens of them. Young musicians. Street performers. Kids from struggling neighborhoods. Some had handwritten notes beside their names. Needs guitar. Needs confidence. Needs someone to listen. Daniel stared. He was helping all these people. Marcus nodded. He never told me about any of them. Marcus smiled sadly. That's because he wasn't doing it for recognition. Daniel flipped another page. At the bottom was a name he recognized. Daniel Reed. He froze. Beneath his name was a sentence. My little brother. Most talented person I know. Most afraid person I know. Daniel laughed through tears. Bruno read over his shoulder. That's a pretty honest brother. Daniel smiled. Too honest. Then he noticed another sentence underneath. If he ever stops playing, don't force him back. Just remind him why he started. Daniel stared at it. That's what tonight was. Bruno nodded. Maybe. Daniel looked at him. You didn't know any of this. No. But you stopped. Bruno smiled. Sometimes you don't need the whole story to know somebody needs a minute. Daniel looked down. I wish Michael had met you. Bruno laughed softly. Maybe he did. Daniel looked confused. What? Bruno pointed toward the wall. There was a photograph Daniel hadn't noticed. It showed Michael standing outside the studio beside a very young Bruno. Daniel's mouth opened. That's you. Bruno stared at the photograph. Yeah. Daniel looked at Marcus. How? Marcus smiled. Michael met Bruno here years ago. Bruno shook his head slowly. I remember this place. Daniel looked at him. You do. I remember coming here when I was young. Marcus was teaching a small group. Michael was playing guitar. Bruno smiled. He showed me a song. Daniel stared at him. What song? Bruno looked at the notebook. Tomorrow. Daniel's face changed. You heard it. Once. Why didn't you tell me? Bruno looked at him. Because I didn't remember the name. I only remembered the melody. Daniel stared at Bruno. You've been carrying part of my brother's song for years? Bruno nodded slowly. I guess I have. The room became quiet. Daniel looked at the piano. Play it. Bruno frowned. What? The melody. Bruno sat at the broken piano. He pressed one key. Then another. Daniel's eyes widened. Bruno played the melody he remembered. Daniel joined him on guitar. For the first time, the song sounded complete. Not perfect. The lights went out so suddenly that, for several seconds, nobody moved. The old Bell Street building disappeared into complete darkness, and the only sound was the rain striking the windows and Daniel's uneven breathing. Bruno immediately reached for his phone and switched on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway was empty. "Who's there?" Bruno called. No answer. Marcus moved toward the back entrance. "Don't," Bruno said. Marcus stopped. "We don't know who we're dealing with." Daniel's hands were shaking. "He knew my father," Eleanor whispered. "Maybe he knows more than that." Bruno looked at Daniel. "Stay close." They waited. Nothing. Then a door slammed somewhere behind them. Bruno turned his flashlight toward the sound. "Marcus, lock the front door." Marcus hurried across the room. Daniel stood beside Bruno, clutching the guitar. "What did that man mean?" Bruno asked Marcus. "I don't know." Daniel looked at him. "You do know something." Marcus shook his head. "Not enough." "Then tell me what you know." Marcus stared at the floor. "Michael was afraid of your father." Daniel froze. "My father?" Marcus nodded. "Not because he was violent. Because he knew things." Daniel's voice became quiet. "What things?" Marcus looked toward the dark hallway. "Your father knew about the recording." "What recording?" "The one Michael made." Daniel frowned. "The one we just heard?" Marcus shook his head. "No. Another one." Daniel stared at him. "How many recordings were there?" Marcus answered. 3. Eleanor looked shocked. "You told me there were only 2. Marcus turned toward her. "I didn't know about the third until tonight." Bruno looked between them. "What's on it?" Marcus shook his head. "I never heard it." Daniel suddenly pointed toward the old counter. "The box." Bruno turned. "What?" "The box we opened. There was something underneath the cassette." Daniel hurried over. He reached into the compartment. His fingers found a folded piece of paper. He pulled it out. A handwritten line appeared across it. "If they ask about the night, don't trust the first story." Daniel stared at it. Bruno read over his shoulder. "That's not exactly comforting." Daniel whispered. "What does it mean?" Marcus answered. "It means Michael knew somebody would eventually come looking." Daniel looked at him. "For what?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know." Suddenly the lights flickered back on. Everyone turned toward the hallway. The man was gone. Bruno walked carefully toward the rear door. It was open. Rain blew inside. Fresh footprints crossed the concrete floor. Daniel stared at them. "He was here." Bruno nodded. "Yeah." Marcus stepped closer. "He wanted us to know that." Daniel looked at the footprints. "Why?" Marcus didn't answer. Bruno turned toward him. "Maybe he's trying to scare you." Daniel shook his head. "No." Bruno looked at him. "What?" Daniel pointed toward the footprints. "He could have taken the tape." Bruno paused. Daniel continued. "He could have taken the box. He could have taken the photograph. He didn't." Marcus looked at Daniel. "Then what was he doing?" Daniel stared into the darkness. "He wanted us to find something." They searched the back room. Behind old shelves. Under broken furniture. Inside cabinets. Nothing. Then Eleanor noticed a small metal panel near the floor. She crouched. "Daniel." He walked over. "What?" She pointed. "There's something written here." He wiped away dust. 3 words appeared. "Ask your father." Daniel stepped backward. "No." Bruno looked at him. "You don't have to do this tonight." Daniel shook his head. "Yes, I do." "Daniel." 21 years, he said. 21 years I've been living with one version of what happened. If somebody is telling me it's wrong, I need to know." Marcus looked at him. "Your father is still alive?" Daniel nodded. "He lives outside the city." Bruno asked, "Can we go there?" Daniel looked at his phone. It was 3:11 a.m. He'll be asleep. Marcus smiled faintly. "He'll wake up." They left Bell Street as the rain became heavier. Daniel sat in the back seat beside Eleanor, holding the guitar case tightly. Bruno drove. Marcus sat in front. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Finally, Daniel said, What was my father like back then? Marcus looked back. Strict. That's putting it mildly. He loved you. Daniel laughed bitterly. He didn't know how to show it. Marcus nodded. Neither did Michael. Daniel stared out the window. Maybe that's where I got it. Bruno glanced at him in the mirror. What? Not knowing how to say things. Bruno smiled. Most people don't. Daniel looked at the guitar. Michael always could. Marcus shook his head. No. He just wrote them down. Daniel smiled sadly. That's true. They arrived at a quiet house on the outskirts of Los Angeles just before 4 a.m. Porch light was already on. Daniel stared at it. He knew we were coming. Bruno parked. How? Daniel shook his head. I don't know. He stepped out. Marcus followed. Eleanor stayed in the car. Bruno walked beside Daniel toward the front door. Daniel knocked. No answer. He knocked again. The door opened slowly. An elderly man stood there, wearing a dark sweater. His hair was completely gray. He looked at Daniel for several seconds. Then his eyes moved to the guitar. His face changed. You found it. Daniel froze. You knew. His father looked at Marcus. You brought them here. Marcus nodded. He deserves the truth. The older man sighed. I was afraid of this. Daniel stepped inside. Afraid of what? His father looked at him. That Michael's plan would survive me. Daniel's eyes widened. What plan? His father closed the door. Sit down. Daniel refused. No. Tell me. His father looked at Bruno. Who is he? Daniel answered. Bruno. His father stared. Bruno Mars. Bruno nodded politely. Sir. The older man looked surprised. Michael talked about you. Bruno's eyes narrowed. He did. Yes. Daniel stared at his father. How did Michael know him? His father shook his head. That's not the important part. Then what is? His father walked toward a cabinet. He opened a drawer and removed a small envelope. This. Daniel stared at it. What's that? The third recording. Daniel's heart stopped. Marcus stepped forward. You had it. The older man nodded. For 21 years. Daniel's voice shook. Why? His father looked at him. Because Michael asked me to keep it. Daniel stared at him. You lied to me. Yes. You told me you hadn't seen him. I lied. Daniel's face hardened. You let me believe I caused his death. His father closed his eyes. I know. Daniel's voice cracked. Why? His father looked at him. Because I thought guilt would keep you close. Daniel stared. What? After Michael died, you were going to leave. You wanted to disappear. Daniel whispered. I did. I was afraid I would lose both my sons. Daniel shook his head. So you let me blame myself? His father nodded slowly. I thought if you believed you owed Michael something, you would stay. Daniel looked sick. You destroyed 21 years of my life. His father lowered his head. I know. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Did Michael know? His father looked at him. Yes. Daniel froze. What? He knew what I was doing. And he still talked to you? The night before he died. Daniel stared. What did he say? His father took a breath. He told me I was wrong. Daniel looked at Marcus. Marcus nodded. That's why Michael went to see him. Daniel's father placed the envelope on the table. He gave me this. Daniel approached slowly. Why didn't you give it to me? His father looked at him. Because I couldn't face what it said. Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was a cassette labeled, For Danny. When you stop blaming yourself. Daniel's hands shook. Bruno stood beside him. Play it. Daniel looked at him. What if? Bruno interrupted gently. Whatever it says, it doesn't change who you are now. Daniel nodded. He placed the cassette into the player. Static. Then Michael's voice. Danny, if you're hearing this, Dad finally gave you the tape. Daniel closed his eyes. Michael continued. I don't know how long it's been. Maybe days. Maybe years. Maybe you haven't heard it at all. Daniel laughed through tears. 21 years. Michael's voice continued. First, I need you to know something. The accident was not your fault. It was not Dad's fault either. It was a terrible accident. Nobody caused it. Daniel opened his eyes. His father looked down. Michael continued, "But there is something Dad doesn't want you to know." Daniel looked at his father. The recording continued. "I was go-" For several seconds after Marcus said her name, nobody in the room moved. Daniel stood beside the old guitar, staring at him as though the single word Sarah had somehow opened a door that had been locked inside his mind for 21 years. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, sometimes softly, sometimes hard enough to sound like fingers knocking on glass. Bruno lowered his phone and looked from Marcus to Daniel's father, waiting for someone to explain. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Is she alive?" Marcus didn't answer. Daniel stepped closer. "Marcus, is Sarah alive?" Marcus closed his eyes. "Yes." Daniel's face changed. He looked at his father. "You knew?" His father nodded slowly. "I knew she survived." "And you never told me?" "Michael asked me not to." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "Everybody keeps saying that." Michael asked. Michael wanted. Michael promised. Michael protected. And somehow everyone decided I didn't deserve to know anything. His voice cracked. "I was his brother." His father lowered his head. "I know." Daniel looked at Marcus. "Who is she?" Marcus took a long breath. "Sarah was 17 when Michael met her." Daniel frowned. 17. She was a street musician. She played violin outside the old train station. Michael heard her one night. Daniel looked toward the guitar. "And he helped her?" "He did more than that. He believed in her." Marcus explained that Sarah had grown up moving from one relative's home to another. She had no stable family, no money for lessons, and no place where she could practice without someone telling her to be quiet. Michael had found her sitting outside Harbor Sound one rainy evening, playing a broken violin with 2 missing strings. Instead of walking past, he stopped. He bought her new strings. Then he brought her inside. He taught her how to read music. He introduced her to Marcus. Within months, Sarah had become part of their small circle of musicians. Daniel listened with growing disbelief. "Why didn't I know her?" Marcus looked at him. "Because Michael didn't want you involved." "Why?" Marcus hesitated. "Because Sarah was in trouble." Daniel's expression tightened. "What kind of trouble?" "Someone was looking for her." "Who?" Marcus shook his head. "We never knew for sure." Daniel looked at his father. "And that's why Michael was meeting Dad that night?" His father nodded. "Partly." "What does partly mean?" His father looked at the floor. Michael believed someone was using Sarah to get access to the studio. Bruno's eyes narrowed. "Access to what?" Marcus answered, "The recordings." Daniel frowned. "What recordings?" Marcus looked at Bruno. "The original masters." Bruno didn't understand. "Why would anyone care about them?" Marcus said, "Because Michael had recorded something important." Daniel's heart began pounding. "What?" Marcus hesitated. "Evidence." Daniel stared. "Evidence of what?" His father finally spoke. "Fraud." The word seemed to change the temperature in the room. Daniel looked at him. "What kind of fraud?" His father explained that years earlier, several young musicians had been pressured into signing contracts they didn't understand. Their songs were being registered under other names. Money disappeared. Credits were stolen. Michael had discovered the pattern after one of Sarah's original compositions was suddenly claimed by someone else. He began investigating. He recorded conversations. He kept copies of contracts. He wrote down names. He was going to expose them, Marcus said. But he never got the chance. Daniel's voice was barely audible. "Because he died." Marcus nodded. "Yes." Daniel stared at the floor. "So the accident," Marcus interrupted gently, "was still an accident." Daniel looked up. "But someone wanted him to stop. We never proved it." Bruno stepped closer. "And Sarah knew?" Marcus nodded. "She knew enough to be afraid." Daniel looked toward the window. "Where is she now?" Marcus took out his phone. "I have an address." Daniel stared at him. "You knew where she was this whole time?" "Not this whole time. I found her again 6 years ago." "And you still said nothing?" Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Everybody was afraid." Bruno looked at Daniel. "Maybe that's why tonight happened." Daniel turned. "What do you mean?" Because everybody has been protecting everybody else for 21 years, and somehow all that protection left you alone with the wrong story. Daniel looked at him. Bruno continued, maybe it's time people stop deciding what you can handle. Daniel nodded slowly. Take me to her. Marcus hesitated. It's almost 5 in the morning. Daniel looked at the guitar. I've waited 21 years. I can wait another hour. But I'm not waiting another day. They left the house shortly before sunrise. Los Angeles was beginning to brighten at the edges of the sky. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and reflective. Bruno drove while Marcus gave directions. Daniel sat beside him, staring through the windshield. His father stayed behind. Before Daniel left, his father had given him the third photograph. It showed Michael standing beside a young woman holding a violin. On the back was a handwritten sentence. She knows what really happened. Daniel had read it 3 times before putting it into his pocket. As the car moved through the quiet streets, Bruno finally said, "You okay?" Daniel laughed softly. "No." Bruno nodded. "Fair answer." Daniel looked at him. "Are you always this calm?" Bruno smiled. "Absolutely not." Daniel looked surprised. "I just hide it better." Daniel laughed. "Michael used to say that." Bruno glanced at him. "Then I would have gotten along with him." After several minutes, they arrived at a modest apartment building near the coast. Marcus pointed toward the entrance. "3rd floor." Daniel stepped out. Bruno followed. Marcus stopped him. "Daniel." Daniel turned. "What?" "Whatever she tells you, remember something." "What?" "Sarah was a kid." Daniel looked at him. "I know. She lost everything too." Daniel's expression softened. "I'm not angry at her." "You might be." Daniel nodded. "Maybe." They climbed the stairs. Marcus knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Finally, a woman's voice came from inside. "Who is it?" Marcus answered. "It's Marcus." Silence. Then the door opened. A woman stood there. She was in her early 40s, with dark hair tied loosely behind her head. She looked tired but strong. Her eyes immediately went to Daniel. She froze. Daniel froze too. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sarah whispered, "Michael's brother." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I knew you'd come eventually." Daniel looked at her. "You knew?" She nodded. "Michael told me." Daniel's voice became sharper. "When?" "The day before he died." Daniel stepped inside. "Then why didn't you find me?" Sarah looked down. "Because he asked me not to." Daniel closed his eyes. "Of course." Sarah flinched. "I'm sorry." Daniel looked at her. "Did you love him?" The question came so quickly that even Bruno looked surprised. Sarah stared at him. "Yes." Daniel swallowed. "Like a brother?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Yes." Daniel nodded. "Good." He looked away. "Because I don't think I could handle anything else tonight." Sarah gave a small, broken laugh. "Neither could I." She invited them inside. The apartment was simple. A violin rested on a chair beside a stack of music books. On the wall was one framed photograph of Michael. Daniel stopped when he saw it. "You kept that?" Sarah nodded. "Every day." Daniel looked at the photograph. "He looks happy." He was. Sarah sat down. Marcus remained standing. Bruno sat quietly near the window. Daniel placed Michael's guitar on the table. Sarah stared at it. "He told me you'd bring that someday." Daniel looked at her. "What else did he tell you?" Sarah took a breath. "That you would be angry." Daniel nodded. "He knew me." Sarah smiled. "He did." "What really happened that night?" Sarah looked at Marcus, then at Daniel. "Michael was going to meet your father because he had discovered something. We know about the contracts." Sarah shook her head. "That's only part of it." Daniel leaned forward. "Then tell me everything." Sarah took a breath. The person stealing the musician's work wasn't acting alone. Someone inside the studio was helping. Marcus closed his eyes. Daniel looked at him. "Who?" Sarah answered. "The person running the business side of Harbor Sound." Daniel frowned. "Who?" Sarah looked at Marcus. "Victor Hale." Daniel had heard the name before. Marcus nodded. "He was the manager." Sarah continued. Victor had access to every recording, every contract, every payment. He could change credits before songs were registered. Daniel asked, "Did Michael confront him?" "Yes." And the stadium lights slowly came back on, but nobody in the audience seemed ready to leave. 30,000 people remained standing, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the stage. Daniel stood beside Bruno Mars, still holding Michael's old guitar against his chest. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. He had imagined this moment for years, but never like this. He had thought healing would feel dramatic, like some invisible weight suddenly disappearing from his shoulders. Instead, it felt strangely quiet. It felt like breathing normally after holding his breath for 21 years. Bruno looked at him and smiled. "You okay?" Daniel nodded. For the first time, Bruno squeezed his shoulder. "Good." Then a voice came from the audience. "Daniel." He looked down. It was Margaret, the elderly woman who had brought the final photograph. She was still standing near the stage. "There's something else," she said. Daniel's smile disappeared. "Something else?" Margaret nodded. Bruno exchanged a concerned look with Marcus. Daniel walked toward the edge of the stage. "What didn't you tell me?" Margaret hesitated. "Michael left something for you." Daniel laughed softly. "Of course he did." The audience laughed with him, breaking the tension for a moment. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small wooden box. "He gave me this the week before he died." Daniel stared at it. "Why didn't you give it to me earlier?" "Because he told me not to unless you were ready." Daniel looked at Bruno. "Apparently everybody knew I wasn't ready." Bruno smiled. "Maybe tonight changed that." Daniel accepted the box. It was old, scratched, and barely larger than his hand. There was no lock. He opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a tiny silver guitar pick. Daniel recognized it immediately. Michael had given him that pick when they were teenagers. Daniel picked up the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. He began reading silently. His expression changed. Bruno watched him carefully. Daniel finally whispered, "He wrote this for the future." "What does it say?" Bruno asked. Daniel looked at the crowd. "He wrote, 'If you are reading this, then you're standing somewhere I never got to stand.'" Daniel swallowed. "He said he hoped I wouldn't be alone." The crowd became quiet again. Daniel continued reading. "He said he hoped I'd find people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." He looked at Bruno. "And he said one day I might meet someone who would stop a whole stadium just to give me a chance." Bruno laughed softly. "That's oddly specific." Daniel smiled through tears. "Yeah." He looked back at the letter. "There's more." Daniel read the final lines silently. Then he lowered the paper. "What?" Sarah asked. Daniel looked toward her. "He wanted us to build the studio." Marcus nodded slowly. "The Harbor Sound Studio?" Daniel nodded. "He wanted it to become a place for musicians who had nowhere else to go." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "That's what he dreamed about." Daniel looked at Bruno. "He wanted the room reopened." Bruno smiled. "Then reopen it." Daniel looked at the crowd. "Not just the room." He turned toward Sarah and Marcus. "The whole place." The audience began applauding. Daniel raised the microphone. "I don't know how we're going to do it." Bruno leaned toward him. "One note at a time." Daniel laughed. "One note at a time." The following months became a blur of work. The fictional Harbor Sound building was renovated from top to bottom. The old recording rooms were repaired. The broken piano was restored. The walls were covered with photographs of musicians who had once played there. Sarah became one of the teachers. Marcus ran the guitar program. Daniel started a songwriting workshop for teenagers who couldn't afford private lessons. And Bruno quietly helped behind the scenes, refusing to put his name on the building. When Daniel asked why, Bruno simply said, "It was Michael's dream. Let it stay his." One afternoon, Daniel walked into the old room alone. Sunlight came through the windows. On the wall hung Michael's photograph. Daniel placed the silver guitar pick beneath it. "You were right," he whispered. "I didn't need to become you." He smiled. "I just needed to become me." A young boy entered the room carrying a battered acoustic guitar. He couldn't have been more than 14. "Mr. Reed." Daniel turned. "Yeah." Can you show me how to play this? Daniel smiled. Absolutely. The boy sat down. Daniel took the guitar and adjusted the strings. What's your name? Evan. Nice to meet you, Evan. Evan looked nervous. I'm not very good. Daniel smiled. Neither was I when I started. Evan looked surprised. Really? Really? Daniel handed the guitar back. The secret isn't being perfect. The secret is playing long enough to discover what your voice sounds like. Evan began playing. The first few notes were rough. Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't correct him immediately. He simply listened. Then he smiled. Somewhere in the hallway, Sarah's violin began playing. Marcus was teaching another student. The building was alive again. That night, Daniel called Bruno. You should come by tomorrow. Bruno laughed. Why? I have something to show you. Is it another 20-year-old mystery? No. Daniel paused. It's better. The next afternoon, Bruno arrived at Harbor Sound. Daniel brought him into the old room. On the wall was a new sign. It read, The Michael Reed Music Room. Bruno stared at it. You did it. Daniel nodded. We did. Bruno looked around. Michael would love this. Daniel smiled. I think so. Then Evan walked into the room carrying his guitar. Mr. Bruno? Bruno looked surprised. Yeah. Can you hear my song? Bruno smiled. I'd love to. Evan sat down and played. It wasn't perfect. His fingers slipped twice. He stopped once and started again. But when he finished, Bruno applauded. Daniel smiled. See? Bruno whispered. He's got something. Daniel nodded. Yeah, he does. Later that evening, Daniel and Bruno stood outside the building. The city lights stretched into the distance. Daniel looked at Bruno. You know, if you hadn't stopped that concert. Bruno smiled. You would have found your way eventually. Daniel shook his head. Maybe. But I might have taken another 20 years. Bruno looked at him. Then I'm glad we met when we did. Daniel smiled. Me too. They stood quietly. Then Daniel asked, Do you ever wonder why some people enter your life at exactly the right moment? Bruno looked toward the street. All the time. Daniel nodded. I think Michael knew. Bruno smiled. Maybe. A few weeks later, the first official concert of the Harbor Sound Music Room took place. The stage was small compared to the arena, but it was packed with young musicians, families, teachers, and friends. Daniel stood backstage holding Michael's guitar. His father sat in the front row. Sarah stood beside him. Marcus tuned his guitar. Bruno watched from the side of the stage. Daniel stepped into the spotlight. The room became silent. 21 years ago, I thought losing my brother meant the end of my music. He looked at the young musicians around him. I was wrong. He smiled. Sometimes losing someone doesn't mean their story ends. Sometimes it means you become responsible for carrying the best part of them forward. The crowd applauded. Daniel looked at Bruno. This song started with my brother. He looked at the young musicians. But tonight, it belongs to all of you. The band began playing tomorrow. One by one, the young musicians joined. Sarah's violin rose above the melody. Marcus's guitar followed. Then Daniel sang. The room slowly filled with voices. Bruno joined near the final chorus. Daniel's father stood. Everyone stood. And when the last note faded, Daniel looked at Michael's photograph hanging above the stage. He smiled. We made it. There was no answer, of course. There never would be. But he didn't need one. He had finally stopped asking the past to give him something it couldn't. Instead, he had taken what Michael left behind and turned it into something living. Something that could grow. Something that could belong to people who hadn't even been born when Michael died. Years later, the story of that fictional night at the arena would still be told by the people who had witnessed it. They would remember Bruno stopping mid-performance. They would remember the nervous street musician walking onto the stage. They would remember the mysterious photograph, the old guitar, the woman named Margaret, and the moment Daniel finally forgave his father. But Daniel remembered something else. He remembered the first note he played after 21 years of silence. It wasn't perfect. His hands shook. His voice cracked. But he played it anyway. And sometimes that is what courage really looks like. Not standing without fear. Not forgetting the people who hurt you. Not pretending the past never happened. Courage is simply taking the next step while carrying everything you've survived. On the final night of the fictional Harbor Sound season, Daniel stood alone on the stage after everyone had gone home. He looked at the empty chairs and smiled. He picked up Michael's guitar